Kia ora koutou. In this section, we're going to have an overview of the Strands, Goals, and Learning Outcomes section of Te Whāriki. That's the blue section. Page 22 of Te Whāriki introduces knowledge, skills, and attitudes. I like to think of these as the triangle of children's learning. So all three are equally relevant and equally valuable when we think about supporting children's learning. So what are these three? Knowledge, that's the thinking side of learning. It's the stuff in children's head, what they know. We can't actually see what a child knows. We can only take a best guess based on what they're doing and what they have to say for our older kids. Skills. Skills are what they're able to do. So that includes physical skills such as running, jumping, crawling, all those, as well as other types of skills, negotiating, compromising. Anything that you're able to do and see or hear, that's a skill. And the third part of the triangle there is attitudes. This is perhaps the least common, I think, for parents to think of straight away, but attitudes is the way you go about doing whatever you're doing in the other areas. So when we're supporting children's learning, we need to consider all three of these aspects. What are we actually trying to support? Are we trying to support the child to gain knowledge, to support them with a skill that they're learning to do, or are we trying to support their attitude? So for example, a child learning the monkey bars, they have to have some knowledge to be able to do this. So they need to know to move their arms in certain ways, and they know that they have to hold on, or they know that they have to swing their bodies. But having the skills to do that, that's a separate thing as well. So they might know that they need to hold on, but not yet have the strength to be able to do it. So that coordination, the swinging, the strength, the climbing, the alternating feet, those are all skills that you need to be able to do the monkey bars. And in terms of attitude, let's think about some attitudes that you might need to do the monkey bars. It is pretty courageous, so you need to have bravery or courage to be able to make it across. You need to have trust in yourself or trust in the adult who's looking out and saying, I'll get you if you fall. So it's these attitudes as well. And as kayako, we can think, well, what are we actually trying to support? Is it the skills? Is it the knowledge? Is it the attitudes? What's our role in supporting children's learning? Dispositions are a bit of a buzzword in education, especially in the early childhood sector in the last 10 years. And I think they take a little bit more to get your head around what they are. So dispositions, sometimes they're defined as a way of being or way of doing. They're habits of mind. They're the tendency. How does a child typically go about doing something, especially if it's their first time doing it? How do they go about doing it? So they're a combination of skills, knowledge, attitudes, all working together to define that tendency. How do they typically do something? It's really important as educators that we see dispositions as being flexible and not fixed. So just in general usage, the language, the word dispositions often has that fixed state that it just describes maybe their temperament or their trait. But within education, it's not fixed. It is flexible. It's growing. And that's our role as kayako, is to support those growing dispositions. So some examples of dispositions: persisting at difficulty, resilience, collaboration, creativity, kawenga, taking responsibility, whakakata, using humor, hotutu, seeking understanding, playfulness. These are all examples of dispositions. So what's the difference between dispositions and learning dispositions? Dispositions covers a whole wide range of things. They can be positive, negative, neutral, varying depending on the context that you're talking about. Learning dispositions are a subset, it's sort of a smaller bubble within the big bubble of dispositions. So for example, giving up easily, that's a disposition, but it's not a learning disposition. Learning dispositions are dispositions that set a child up to be a lifelong learner, set them up for lifelong success in their ability to learn. So giving up easily isn't going to set them up for success as a learner, but the flip side of that, perseverance, trying hard, sticking at things when they get tough, that will set them up for success as a learner. One thing that's really important to think about with dispositions and learning dispositions is that they're influenced by our culture as well. So for example, values that are valued in one culture, dispositions that are valued in one culture would be different from in another culture. Traditionally, Westerners would value independence, children be able to do things for themselves, whereas in Māori culture, that interdependence would be a lot more important. And certainly there's fluidity and ideas shift over time, but that's just one example of a cultural difference. If you are interested in learning more about learning dispositions, these are some theorists that you might want to look into a bit further. Margaret Carr is a locally well-known person. She's previously based at the University of Waikato, and she's internationally well-known for her research into learning dispositions. Guy Claxton is British, and his model is called Learning Power Muscles. And Carol Dweck is an American who's come up with a theory about mindsets as her research. Another great place to learn more ideas is the Play Center Education Program. So we touch on these theorists and more in learning dispositions within the Play Center Education Program. This blue section of Te Whāriki really goes in depth into children's learning. The principles section of Te Whāriki was the foundation. The principles are very broad, all-encompassing, and overlapping as they're meant to be. This blue section is probably where you spend most of your time working. So it digs deep. What is children's learning? What does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? And as we go through the rest of the section, the skills, knowledge, attitudes, and dispositions come through in every section. So this is what children are able to do. This is what they're able to know. This is what they might be feeling. These are ways, tendencies that we can support them to be learners. Pages 24 and 25 have an overview of the strands, goals, and learning outcomes that are detailed in the further pages after that. I thought it'd be useful just to go through each strand briefly, just to talk about what it means and look at the te reo phrase as well and the sort of the meaning behind that. So the first one, mana atua, is well-being. So this is not only physical well-being, but emotional, spiritual, cultural well-being as well. When we look at the te reo words there, mana, that's the power within a person, inside a person, and atua means God or gods. So from a Māori perspective, this strand is not just about washing your hands and making healthy food choices. It's actually about spiritual well-being as well. Belonging, mana whenua. Whenua is the word for land, and it's also the word for placenta. So this strand really signifies the connection with people with the land. From a Māori worldview, that's very important, the connection of the people with the land. So it's belonging to the land, belonging to the place. Whereas mana tangata, tangata is people. So that's about belonging to the people, belonging to the group, contributing to society. Mana reo, communication. And reo is language, specifically in the Kohanga Reo version, speaking about te reo Māori and the value of supporting the language, supporting the culture. And the last but not least is mana aoturoa, exploration. Ao is world or worlds, and turoa, the many, many worlds. So it's a very similar idea, exploring the many worlds, the material, physical, social, all those worlds, how do they link together, exploring those. So if you take a look at the physical copy of the book, you'll notice that each strand has the same layout. Each strand has 5 pages with a bit of an overview at the beginning. Then it has a column for goals, and each strand will have between 3 or 4 goals. These goals aren't necessarily goals for children. These are more goals for us as adults to consider. So at the top it says goals, children, and experience an environment where all the things below happen. And that's actually our role as adults, as kaiako, to create that environment and support that environment. So for example, the first goal there, children and experience an environment where their health is promoted. So I've never met a child turn up at Play Center and say, today my goal is for my health to be promoted. But that's something that we as adults should be thinking about in the curriculum that we're planning and enacting for our children. The next column for each strand are the learning outcomes. So this is one of the big changes from the previous version of Te Whāriki to this one. Previously, there were approximately 120 learning outcomes in Te Whāriki, and what the review team found is that there were just far too many for them to be used effectively. So they've been consolidated and condensed a bit into 20 learning outcomes in this version. And the aim is that by having fewer, more focused learning outcomes, that they'll be more achievable. And this is actually looking at the children's learning. So over time and with guidance and encouragement, children become increasingly capable of, and then those are your 20 learning outcomes throughout Te Whāriki. So that's actually where the learning is happening. These are the things that we're seeing. The third column on that page there is called Evidence of Learning and Development. And this, I think, is my favorite part of Te Whāriki overall. This column here for each of these 5 strands has so much wealth of information. It helps put the learning that you're seeing and hearing into words. It talks about the joy, the amusement, the illumination of numbers. It talks about the capacity for self-regulation and resilience, the capacity for tolerating and enjoying a moderate degree of change, puzzling, sense of responsibility. There's so many rich words in there that becoming familiar with the language and the ideas in that column will help you in your learning stories. It'll help you in your conversations that you're having. It'll help you in your discussions. So definitely worth becoming familiar with that column there. The next 2 pages in each strand talk about examples of good practice, or examples of practice that promote the learning outcomes. And that's broken down into your 3 age groups there, your infants, your toddlers, and your young children. So what does the strand actually look like for your babies, or your toddlers, or your older children? It gives specific examples. In the last 2 sections for each strand, I wouldn't expect new people to play center to pay much attention about early on, but once you've been around for a while, you're starting to work through the education program, maybe you've taken on a leadership role within center, definitely come back to these and take a look. So the first of them is considerations for leadership, organization, and practice. And the second one there are questions for reflection. And we'll be working through some of these for each strand over the next 5 units as we go. So I know that's been a lot of me talking, but hopefully it's given you a bit of a helpful understanding as to the structure of the section and how it's set out. My challenge to you through this PLD and after this PLD into next term is how can your play center move beyond the strands and goals to utilize the rich ideas within this section of the curriculum. In my experience, a lot of play centers, every play center uses the strands and many play centers use the goals. But I'd like you to dig deep. I'd like you to get into those learning outcomes, into the evidence of learning and development. Use reflective questions. Think about the considerations for leadership. Reflect, go back, look at those examples of good practice as well and integrate some of those. So that's my challenge to you. Let's see how you go.